Let me begin with a somewhat proverbial statement, which is the reduction of, I think, Romans 1:18 through the end of the chapter. When we deny the presence and reality of God, then we will always deny the standard and morality of God. If we decide and determine within ourselves that there is no God, then it may not happen immediately, but all of the standards and ethics that were built on top of the reality of God, they will go away. And this is what Romans 1 has really been about, which is the beginning of the denial of God, and then all of the things in your life, in your conduct, that begin to go away because of that. So you see that God-centeredness is absolutely fundamental to being a godly person and to living a righteous and a moral life. It is imperative for a society to have a God with a lasting standard, or things will begin to break down. As we've seen in the past couple weeks, these deviations, which have their ultimate expression in worshiping creature over against the Creator, they do not start in any kind of express rebellion or a decision within the person to say, I today am simply going to disobey the God who I believe is existing. What we saw and looked at last week is that it begins within the heart in a very passive way. It doesn't even begin in your thoughts to say, I'm going to be rebellious in that sense. As Paul said in Romans 1:21, it begins when we do not honor God as God, and when we do not give thanks to him for the countless blessings that as God he's given to us. And when a heart begins to be apathetic and ungrateful, then it's empty. That's an emptying of what should be in there to make it healthy. When it's apathetic and ungrateful, then it's empty. And then in that environment, it is very conducive to futile thinking, worthless thoughts. And that's what we've been looking at happens. Now, over the past weeks when we've been looking at it, and by the way, today we're going to finish Romans 1. Can we get an applause on that? I really had to work hard to make the rest of this Romans 1 into one message, but we're going to finish it today. We'll start next week in Romans 2. But we have seen, I think, really clearly that God has wrath, that he has a right to be wrathful. We've looked at why it is that he's angry with man. We've looked at principally what it is that makes God angry. It's the denial of God and the ultimate worship of creature. But the thing that we haven't looked at, and I said several weeks back that we were going to, and that this should be very informative for us in our world today, is that we would look at what it looks like even now today when the God of heaven pours out his wrath on man. That's the thing that we haven't done. What does it actually look like? What characteristics and actions of people are indicative of having been given up by God? Now, whatever it is, Paul said in chapter 1 and verse 18 that it's very clear. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness. I don't know if you remember the basis of that word, revealed, apocalyptite, apocalypse. It's a big, obvious, huge revelation. So whatever it is that Paul is going to spell out, we're going to look at this morning, is something that should be very obvious. So really the question is, what is the essence of God's wrath? Is it fire? Is it death? Is it a tsunami? Paul tells us in three strategic places the exact same statement. He tells us exactly what it is. What is the wrath of God in its essence? First of all, in verse 24, Romans 1:24, therefore God gave them up. Verse 26, for this reason, God gave them up. Verse 28, God gave them up. This is the essence of the wrath of God, and that's precisely why I've been saying all along that God's wrath is the antonym of the gospel. It's the counterpart of the gospel. The wrath of God is the opposite of the gospel. And the reason I say that is because in the gospel, Romans 1:16, men are made to be righteous. Men who are out there are made to be righteous, and they're brought near and given salvation by the God of the heavens. In the gospel, we're there and we're brought in. But in the wrath of God, we're somewhere in the proximity of God, and then we're given up. So it's the opposite of gospel, which should spur us to give gospel, knowing what people are under, giving up. We want them to be brought near. So this morning, here's the outline for the message. I have two questions that I want to ask concerning God giving men up. First of all, what does it look like when that happens? The wrath of God is him giving them up. That's all it is. No longer do they have the sanctions and the provisions and the protection of the conscience and the sovereignty of the will of God over their lives, directing and bringing them and leading them to a good end. No longer is that there. It's given up. That's what it is. So the question is, what does it look like when somebody has been given up by God? And secondly, why does it look the way that it looks? So those are the questions. Starting with the first one. When God gives men up, basically two things happen. Men, number one, begin to use their bodies in dishonoring ways, dishonorable ways. Man begins to use this vessel, which is holy, in ways which are unholy. And number two, the thinking of man is debased. The mindset of the psyche of man is brought to a worthless state. Those are the two things. And as we looked at last week, it probably happens in the reverse order of that, starting in the mind, working outward in the expression of the body. But this is the way that Paul presents it in chapter 1. He's going to, this morning, starting in verse 24, he's going to point out the dishonoring of the body, and then he's going to go to more general, the debasing of the mind. These are the things that happen when men are given up. And so verse 24, he gives just a kind of a basic general idea of what it means to be given up by God, or what it looks like. It says, therefore, God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves. General speaking, gave them up to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies. You might imagine a million different ways. Then he gets really specific in verse 26 and 27. He says, for this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. So same terminology as verse 24, but he gets more specific. For their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. And the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another. Men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. That ought to bring a heavy sigh. Look around. Look around America, 2020. Look at the streets of New York City. Look at the sign of the covenant of God never to destroy the world again by flood, the rainbow, and see its use. Because Paul points out in Romans chapter 1 that the clearest, most overt, most blatant, most obvious sense that a person or a society has been given up by God is in the activity of homosexuality. So, as I was pondering this, I realized, especially studying through Romans 1, that Paul is not saying this is the only evidence that a person is given up. In fact, I would say that historically, to societies, this would probably be more marginal in terms of the percentage of a population that would be engaging in that activity. Paul's point isn't to say, if you're given up by God, you're going to go and engage in homosexual behavior. Paul is speaking of, first of all, just to kind of get your attention, what is the most obvious indication? And then he's going to work to more general, subtle things that I think should prove to be more piercing and more convicting for us as we consider, where do I really stand with my God? You may say, that isn't at all a temptation to me. I've never done anything like that. But there is much more to the story than just that. Paul's point is not, that is what a person given up by God is going to do. And anybody who's not involved in that is not given up by God. That isn't at all the point. Look at verses 28 through 31, where he gets more specific. Since they didn't see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind. So here's where the origins of it is. It's in the thinking. It's in the mind. It's in the way that you reason. It's in your rationalization. It's cognitive. And then, if something's wrong here, just imagine how many things can be wrong out here. So he gets more specific in what exactly has happened. God gave them up to a debased mind, and the word debased means worthless. He gave them up to a worthless mind to do what ought not to be done. He says they were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, to covet, to want something that I can't have and want it really bad, malice. They are full of envy, filled murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. I asked the question, what does it look like when a person has been given up by God? Your answer is Romans 1, 24 through 31. It is the picture. It isn't that every person is going to have every one of those qualities at exactly the same time. It is that a person given up by God is going to be immersed and living in what he says ought not to be done. It is a mind given up to do things that ought not to be done, and it works itself out in a lot of ways. Now, I hope that as I read through this list, that you as a perceptive person would have asked or at least questioned, why in the world is homosexual behavior and disobedience to parents in the exact same list as evidence of the same thing? What do those have to do with one another? That is you could pose that as a riddle. What does homosexuality and disobedience to parents have in common? And as they seem to be two extremes, like totally different things, what I want to do is kind of walk through and show that they share a very common problem. And so they're really not that different. They are expressive of the same thing that happens, and they just choose a different direction. So the first clue as to what they have in common is verses 26 and 27. So look at that. I hope your Bible's open. Look at verse 26 and pay close attention to the grammar choices of Paul. He says, remember, this is his chief example. When he says, when he finally gets to this point of, he's talking about God being angry and why he's angry and everything. Then he finally says, God gave him up, right? And then the first thing he does is gives this really obvious thing. So here's chief example, and all the other examples are going to fall under this in the same way. Notice the grammar choices. For their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. So the word nature is being used here. There's something that is natural, there's nature, and then they went to something that is against nature. It is unnatural. He says, the men likewise. It means in the same way. The men in the same way gave up what is natural, gave up natural relations with women, and were consumed with passion for one another. So in these simple words, Paul reveals that the rules of nature are, first of all, very obvious to us, and most importantly for our discussion, binding on us. Let me say that again. Nature and the general rules of it are, first of all, very obvious to us, and they are binding on us. And the question you have to ask is, well, first of all, let me tell you why I say that. That's Paul's indictment. The indictment against them is that they went against what's natural. He's saying they're doing things that are unnatural. So what's his point? They should have been doing what is natural. And the implication is that what is natural is binding. And it's binding on us in a moral sense, which should bring the question, why is it that nature and the rules of it are binding on us in a moral sense? What is it of this world around me, this very physical world that I see every day, and the rules of physics and science that would be binding on me in a salvational kind of way? That's the question. I think it's a good question. Here's the answer. Nature is not autonomous. Do you understand that? Nature is not, as Darwin said, out on its own, merely having reactions and blindly developing and changing as history moves on. Paul's argument back to the beginning of our discussion in Romans 1:18 and following is there is a God, first of all, over everything, and nature is pointing up to him. All of nature is saying, there's a God. There's a God. Look, there's a God over all the world, which implies then that nature is not autonomous, meaning in practice that nature is subordinate to God. Nature does not get to simply do whatever it desires. Because God made it and it is subordinate to God, then the rules of nature are ordered after God. And if you, by implication, break any of those rules of nature, then you are no longer subordinate to God. You're getting out of that. Now, if there were no God, this would be different. If there was no God over the world, we would be able to rise above it. And this is exactly, as you pay attention to Dawkins and Sam Harris and these persons, this is exactly their contention. There can't be a God, otherwise I cannot continue doing what it is that I would desire. See, they know the way that it does work. If there was no God, if you and I are merely animals, who's to say what's right and wrong? I can do whatever I want. And why should I follow a rule? It's survival of the fittest, and I will choose what that means for me. But the thing Paul's pointing out, and I think this is a critical point, is that natural law is as binding on us. Listen to this. Natural law is as binding on us as is the Mosaic law. It is as binding on us as is the law of Christ. Because in the same way, it is subordinate to God, and it's there required to do as God said that it should do. I want you to turn to chapter 2 and look at this verse. Look at verse 14. Start there. I'm just going to read just a moment. He says, "For when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature, there's our word again. When Gentiles who don't have the law by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they don't have the law. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts while their conscience also bears witness. Paul is actually saying that God's morality, in a general sense, more or less, to kind of get a blurry picture of it, the general moral sense and compass of God is actually written into the fabric of creation. It's actually written into the way things in nature work. And it's written into your conscience. God put it on you. When you came into the world as an image of God, there were things God wrote in there from the beginning that you should inherently know, which connect and point back to God to give you a general compass of what is right and what is wrong. Some of them are by observation. Some of them are things I can see with my eyes in nature. And some of them are things that I may not be able to explain in my heart, but I know that's not right. I don't know if I can give you a scientific reason for it, but I know it's not right. And so does everybody else. Now, the ones that are very obvious to the eyes, and the reason why Paul started with his chief example, which is homosexual behavior, as a break away from what's natural, is because human sexuality is the design of God concerning human sexuality is the most obvious thing in the world. And it's the most obvious on two fronts. Anatomy, and by that I mean, here's another riddle, men and women fit together, and reproduction. And by that I mean, you cannot create life. The universe, nature, all of nature doesn't create life without the coming together of men and women. So here's this example that he puts up there, just to kind of put it out there to say, here's the depths of where you can go. You can go to a point where natural law is totally, it's not even seen for the obvious thing that it is, which is right before your eyes. It's obvious that one of these is designed, and one of these is intentional, and one of them works really well, and one of them, you really got to do some twisted things to make it work. And even then, it doesn't work. It brings disease and all sorts of heartache and all sorts of societal issues and problems. So that's the thing that Paul is saying. And he's saying that there's this indictment against them because they broke against natural law. Now, if you're perceptive, you're picking up then, what is the connection between, as I asked at the beginning, between homosexual behavior and disobedience to parents? What do they have in common? Both of them are a break from natural law. In fact, everything in Romans 1 is a break from natural law. So I'll ask this, and you might be asking it. How is it that disobedience to parents is unnatural? Why is that unnatural? Because it's in the same list as these others that broke from nature. I think perhaps a better question to ask would be, why has every civilization for all of anthropological history understood that children have to obey mom and dad? And not only that, but cultures and societies at large write into the general culture and way of life that not only do you obey them in the sense of a little kid listening to mom and dad and obeying them in that sense. That's not necessarily what's being talked about, a 3, 4, 5-year-old kid who's being unruly. It will eventually get to that when it's not enforced. But the thing that he's talking about here is the dishonoring. Everyone knows kids must honor mother and father. And it isn't something that goes away when you're 30 years old or 40 years old or out of the house even. There's something that you know within yourself, and so has everyone else. I have to honor my mother and father. That does not mean I must, when I'm 40, do everything they tell me to do, because I may at this point know a little better than they do, but I must always have honor for them. I must always do good by them. And this is something everyone has known. And you must ask, why? Why do we know that's to be so? It's written on our hearts. In fact, the same thing goes on when he's speaking about gossip and slander and pride. And again, I think we have to ask, how is this a breaking from natural law? You think about that? It's one of those things you can't necessarily explain it in the same way that you can explain human sexuality as a breaking from natural law when it goes sideways. But when you see somebody, we will excuse things in ourselves all the time and we think we're doing just fine. But when you look and you see somebody who is prideful, boastful, a gossip, don't you just look on them and think, that ain't right? Don't you know when you see someone else who's high on their horse and who speaks badly of everyone else? Don't you know it shouldn't be that way? Now, when it's in me, I don't see it so well because I'm not looking in the mirror. When it's in me, I have reasons and excuses for all that I do, so that isn't bad. But when I see it in somebody else, I know that it's bad. This is natural law. In fact, that is the root of do unto others as you would have them do unto you. We may not see our own behavior as wicked and depraved and bad when it really is that, but we always know when it's somebody else. And so does everybody else know when they see it in you. This, again, is the point that Paul's trying to bring in Romans chapter 1 and Romans chapter 2 when he speaks of these people, this people group who didn't have a law. They didn't have Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. They didn't know the name of Yahweh. They didn't know the context of deliverance and redemption from Egypt and brought into the promised land and being brought under a covenant relationship with God where God gave them all of these rules right before their eyes in the same way that human sexuality is right before our eyes. But he says, look, you can actually find civilizations of people who know nothing of God. They don't even know the rules of God, and they're following them more or less. In fact, he goes on in Romans chapter 2 to say that some of them who never knew the name of God are going to be excused on the day of salvation. They will not be judged by God on the day of salvation. They will not be damned by God on the day of salvation because they, in their hearts, had God's law written on it, and as their conscience as a guide, always pointing back to God, they did what they were supposed to do. That's astounding that he would make a claim like that. But I think that it's also evidential when we look out and see the way societies work. If you're in the innermost Amazon, men are still marrying women. Theft is still wrong. Murder is still punished. Being a gossip is still not liked. So, what does it look like when God gives someone up? They break away from the rules which are most obvious to everyone else. They break away from natural law. Now, briefly, the second question is, why does it look that way? For example, or to clarify, when God, because this is what he says he gave them up. Why, when God gives men up, is it always manifested in a break from natural law? Have you thought about that? Read again Romans 1:21. Although they knew God, they didn't honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking. Now, so they knew God at one point. And here's this apathy, there's apathy and ingratitude which set in. And then poor thinking came out of it. Now, look at verse 23. He speaks of the fact that they exchanged the glory of the immortal God. This is a point Paul is really ambitious to keep impressing on us through Romans 1. They exchanged the glory of immortal God for images of mortal creatures. And so in verse 24, he says, therefore, so that points up to what they just did. They exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images of mortal creatures. They got rid of God, therefore God gave them up. In verse 25, they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and they worshiped the creature rather than the creator. So verse 26 says, for this reason, God gave them up. And then in verse 28, it says, since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up. So he brings this connection 3 times. They gave up God. They gave up God. They gave up God. And because they gave up God, God gave them up. That's the order. They gave up God, so God gave them up. So why does it work out in this way that when God gives them up, nature is no longer something that is of importance to them? Basic facts and reason and things that men have known for generations just go out the window, as we're seeing right now in 2020 America. Why does it work that way? Well, I want you, if I had a PowerPoint, I would show you a diagram, but I think it's simple enough that you can imagine it. When everything is the way that it's supposed to do, here's the diagram. God, and then there's a line, and then nature. God is up here, nature is beneath it. All things work well when nature is beneath God. Nature is subordinate to God. The people within nature are submissive to God because God is above them. There's God, and then there's nature. But this nature, imagine, move over again, it's apathetic nature. God is still up there. Nature is now ungrateful, apathetic toward the honor of God. Now move down another. God, nature. Nature puts an X across God. Nature beneath says there is no God. You are in parenthesis right there with nature. You're a part of it. Move to the last stage. God had been X'd out formerly. He's not up there any longer. Nature is still here. You go to the top. And when you're at the top, when you are the God, then you get to reorder and do with nature whatever it is that you want, even if it doesn't make any sense, even if it leads to corrupted things, even if it breaks down society. This is what you're seeing in America right now. And I think we can understand in our country that this didn't happen overnight. How many years ago, for those who've been around longer than I have, did we decide we don't need the Bible in education anymore? What did that teach kids? What did that teach kids? What did that teach the generations? That anything you need to know to function and live and go about in society as a person of intellect, you don't need to know anything about God. Now, you do need to know about Darwin, and he will be in there intimately. You'll learn about him in biology. You'll learn about him in history. You will learn about him in all of your classes. But God, you do not need, because God is separate from nature. Nature was rendered to be autonomous from God. Education is separate from God. I've been reading Francis Schaeffer over the past couple weeks, and I've mentioned him to you. I told my friend, I just stumbled on this. I was reading Schaeffer this last week, the philosophical works of Schaeffer. And I told my friend, I just stumbled on this, and he put a little ellipses and said, stumbled. And I said, well, I guess I didn't really stumble. I think God leads us to things we need to know at the time we need to know them. But Schaeffer was chronicling through the major problems in history. And he said that it always happens when nature, so there's this delineation between God and nature. And when nature, even if men don't expressly seek to get rid of God, but when they make nature its own separate category that doesn't need to answer to God or get its answers from God, nature always eats up God, always. And God goes away. And this is what happened. Now, I don't know how long back in our country that was. 60 years? What was it? What year? Do we know when the Bible went out? Prayer went out in 63. Okay, so we're sitting at about 60 years since this point. Now, there have been things building up to that, but here we are. And look, this is exactly what's happened in our society. There's a generation who thinks that all of life, the polity, education is separate from God. And so you went to the top. God is gone. And you're seeing people saying, look, any lifestyle is acceptable. We can do what we want. And I think it's important that the church understand where that went wrong. Now, I want to close with a word of hope, because I understand that as we've gone through Romans 1, it's not the kind of thing that especially makes you feel jolly, especially when it's preached on for 4 weeks. I understand that, and I hope that you have the wherewithal to know the reason behind this and the purpose and intention of going deeper into it. But I do want to finish with this word of hope, which is included in the ultimate trajectory of Romans as a letter. Paul is not using Romans 1. Please understand this. Paul is not using Romans 1 as a word of the decisive final judgment of, these people who you see doing these things, they're gone. He's not using it in that way. He is using it to point out that there has been a prejudgment that has happened over their lives. And therefore, there is an urgency for the gospel now. This is why he started in verse 16 by saying, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. And he said, I'm coming to Rome. Do you understand what Rome was? Do you understand the morality of Rome and the kinds of things they did in their society, in their temples as a people? Oh, we think America is bad now. It is not. It's nowhere near what they were. And Paul's saying, I'm going to Rome to bring a harvest for God out of those very same people. The point of Romans is not to say those people are gone forever. The point of Romans is to say they will be if we don't rescue them from the fire with the gospel message. In fact, the thing that Paul says in 1 Corinthians, he gives a list that is so similar to Romans chapter 1. And at the end of this list of actions and lifestyles that are going to be condemned by God, that won't inherit the kingdom of God, he points at the Corinthian church. Miranda and I went to Corinth and looked at the things they did there and read about their history. And he said to the Corinthians, to the church, to Christians, redeemed Christians, such were some of you. These very same things, the worst of things in society. He says, such among homosexuality and murder were listed. He says, these were you. You were that. But he says, you were washed. You were sanctified. You were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and by the Spirit of our God. So we have, I think, a good understanding of what's going wrong and why it's going wrong and what it means. But the call to us this morning is bring the gospel to your friends. If it offends them, so be it. It is your greatest grace. It is their greatest news. Those who are lost in this are not eternally lost yet. And we can bring them to Christ. So as we go through Romans, gospel is going to be at the center, and it should be at the center of who we are as a church. We do not look out at the world and say, you guys are a bunch of horrible people, and we're a bunch of really good people. Next week, and please get ready for this, chapter 2, Paul is going, in chapter 1, he's been getting the amens of the religious group as he pointed outward. But as we all nod our heads and say, amen, 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 in chapter 2, he's going to point a finger at us and say, therefore, you are without excuse, you who judge. And he's going to speak to us. So we're not going to be talking about them anymore. We're going to be talking about us and how that should shape us and change us. Appreciate the attention. Let's be gospel-centered. If you need Jesus, please come forward and be baptized as we sing this song.